They called him just another broke worker until the billionaire froze, whispered, "That's my son." Some men build empires, others sweep the floors of those empires, never knowing they built them too. This is a story of one silent worker and the billionaire who forgot the cost of his own legacy. If you find value in real stories told with clarity and truth, make sure to subscribe to stay informed with Real Father Stories. He clocked in at 5:57 a.m., 3 minutes early. Always 3 minutes early. Every morning for the past 16 years, Ernest Green had pushed open the rusted gate of Allied Forge Industries, a steel plant on the edge of town, where workers were expected to keep their heads down and hands calloused. Ernest did both. He wasn't a welder. He wasn't a machinist. He didn't run the giant cranes or pour molten metal. He mopped the floors, swept the steel dust, unclogged toilets, hauled broken pallets to the trash yard. They called him OG, not out of respect, but short for old guy. He didn't mind, not really, because Ernest had learned something in life. If you expect applause, you'll die of silence. But if you work for something greater, even the silence can be holy. So he worked, quietly, diligently, day after day in that same faded blue jumpsuit with E. Green stitched over the heart, a name most had stopped reading years ago. But the truth was, Ernest wasn't just a janitor. He was a father. And every evening when his shift ended, he'd take the long bus ride home, collapse into a worn recliner, and open a worn photo album filled with pictures of a boy he hadn't seen in 18 years. A boy named Miles. If you find value in real stories told with clarity and truth, make sure to subscribe to stay informed with Real Father Stories. The factory cafeteria was always loud at noon, the kind of noise that made quiet men disappear. But that day, Ernest stayed a little longer than usual. He lingered near the corner window tray, untouched eyes scanning the foggy distance beyond the yard. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was the ache in his left knee, the one that hadn't healed right since the warehouse accident in '08. Or maybe, just maybe, it was fate breathing on the back of his neck. Because while Ernest scraped leftover rice into a trash bin, two men in tailored suits walked past the loading dock and into the main floor. One of them was the billionaire owner of Allied Forge Industries, Charles Whitman III. A man so powerful, most employees had only seen his face on plaques or Forbes covers. He never visited. Never needed to, until today. Whitman looked out of place among the grease-stained machines. He clutched a brown leather briefcase and flanked by two aides, headed for the executive office upstairs. Ernest didn't look up. He rarely did. But Whitman did. Their eyes didn't meet. Not yet. But the billionaire paused for half a second, something about that old man by the mop bucket. His brow furrowed, a flicker, a flash. Then he was gone. Later that evening, long after the plant had emptied, one of Whitman's aides rifled through a locked file drawer. In the archives, something the company hadn't touched since the early 2000s. And there it was. A dusty envelope marked maternity leave request, Green Clara, 2005. Inside it, a black and white photo, a hospital bracelet, a baby's name, and a signature Charles Whitman had written nearly 2 decades ago. Miles Whitman Green. Whitman hadn't slept. Not really. He sat in the back of his chauffeured car the next morning, the envelope in his lap like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He didn't speak to his assistants. He didn't check his phone. He just stared out the tinted glass as they approached the factory gates again. "Sir," his aide finally asked, "should we notify the plant manager you're returning?" Whitman didn't respond. He simply said, "Tell no one. I need to see him before he disappears again." Back inside the factory, Ernest was already on the floor, mop in hand, the same steady rhythm as every day for 14 years. To the workers around him, he was invisible. To management, a box to tick. But to Charles Whitman, he was now a ticking memory bomb. As Whitman entered the facility, he broke protocol. He walked directly toward the janitor, no security detail, no PR smile. Ernest froze, still gripping the mop, unsure if this was some mistake. "Sir, I think you're looking for—" Whitman cut him off. "What's your name?" Ernest blinked. "Ernest Green, sir. OTC, sir." That was it. Whitman stared at him, not with contempt, not with pity, but with something else. Something that had started 20 years ago in a hospital room he never visited again. He whispered almost inaudibly, "You called him Miles." Ernest's heart stopped. He hadn't said that name in over a decade, had buried it like everything else. How do you?" Ernest stammered. But Whitman was already trembling. His voice cracked, hands shaking slightly as he reached into his coat and pulled out the old photo. The one with the birthmark. The one with the dimpled chin. "You raised him?" Whitman asked, his eyes glistening. Ernest couldn't speak. He just nodded, and in that nod, years of struggle, sacrifice, and silence broke like a dam. The floor supervisor stared from a distance, confused. But the billionaire didn't care who was watching. He stepped closer. And for the first time in his adult life, Charles Whitman III called a janitor sir. "I believe I owe you everything." The whispers started like static, just one or two workers peeking around crates, pausing their forklifts, slowing their machines. They couldn't hear everything, but they saw enough: the billionaire, the janitor, a photograph, a look on Whitman's face no one had ever seen. Then the most unthinkable thing happened. Whitman hugged him. No press, no cameras, just a silent, raw embrace between a man in a $10,000 suit and another in stained boots, arms still damp from scrubbing the break room sink. And then Whitman said it loud enough for the floor to hear. "You didn't just raise him, you made him who he is." The words shot across the factory like an electric current. By the time Ernest walked back to the break room, Hands still shaking, the room was dead silent. People stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. Calvin from shipping whispered, "Yo, is this a joke?" Maria from front office muttered, "That man's his what?" And then Jake, the young kid who used to joke about Ernest's old mop, stood up slowly and said, I think the boss just called him his father." The room exploded. "You serious?" The Charles Whitman. "No way, man. Ernest, he's been here for like forever." But Ernest wasn't listening. He sat down at his usual table, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a folded, worn-out piece of paper. It was a drawing, childlike, messy, half-faded ink. It read, "Dad, I'll buy you a car someday. Love, Miles." He stared at it trembling, because in that moment, the factory break room didn't matter. What mattered was that after years of being everyone's background noise, the man who swept the floors was no longer invisible. And the son he raised, the one he once found crying outside a group home, had just turned the world upside down by whispering a single word, "Dad." In. It started with a tweet. One blurry photo. Whitman hugging Ernest. Caption, "Is this real? Charles Whitman hugging a janitor and calling him Dad." 15,000 likes in 2 hours. By morning, it was everywhere. Talk shows debated the story. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire CEO reunites with long-lost father in factory break room. From janitor to father of an empire." Ernest's phone, which rarely rang outside calls from grocery coupons, was now buzzing nonstop. News stations, podcasters, book agents. The factory security had to escort him through back entrances. The workers who once ignored him now offered rides, coffee, even apologies. But Ernest, he stayed quiet. He declined interviews, turned down money. All he said was, "I only did what any father would do." Still, the world couldn't stop digging. Old adoption files were pulled. People discovered Miles Whitman had been raised under a different name before age 6. Ernest's foster records surfaced. Reporters tracked down neighbors who remembered the quiet man with the little boy who loved robots. But one moment hit hardest, a clip from a charity gala. The week before, Whitman had spoken about anonymous heroes. "There's someone out there who gave me everything and never asked for credit. One day, I hope to thank him." That video now had 20 million views. And right beside it, a photo of Ernest standing next to a mop bucket, unaware that millions were now calling him America's father. But not everyone was celebrating. Some shareholders saw trouble, and someone close to Whitman, someone powerful, was about to push back hard. Ernest had enemies, but he never knew how close they were. Inside Whitman Global, a storm was brewing. Not from the press, not from the public, but from Alan Devereaux, Charles Whitman's godfather, and the man who had raised him after the orphan papers were filed. Alan wasn't just family. He was the company's oldest board member, the architect of its rise, and he hated what was happening. "You're risking the company's legacy for a factory fairy tale," he growled at Charles, slamming a manila folder on the table. Inside copies of Ernest's old employment record, janitor low pay fired twice for protesting unsafe conditions. Alan had dug up everything. This man has no pedigree, no education. You want the world to see this mop pusher, as the father of a global CEO. But Charles didn't flinch. He is my father. You made sure I forgot him once. That's not happening again. That line hit Alan like a gunshot, because behind the power suit and prestige, Alan had a secret. He was the one who sealed Ernest's adoption papers all those years ago, convincing child services the boy was better off in a wealthy home. He'll hold you back, he told young Charles decades earlier. You want a future, you forget the past. And Charles had believed him until now. The confrontation in the boardroom turned bitter. Alan threatened legal action. The board grew nervous. And that's when Charles did something no CEO in his position would dare. He called an emergency shareholders meeting, live-streamed, full press invited. If telling the truth about my father costs me this company, so be it. But I won't build an empire on a lie. The room went silent. Then, a slow clap from the back. It was the head of HR, then legal, then the CFO. One by one they stood, applauding. Outside, thousands were watching live. Gotcha, real father trended worldwide. And Ernest, he was in the break room watching it all on a tiny TV, tears streaming down his face, hands trembling. He whispered, I thought I'd lost him forever. The storm had passed, but the echoes remained. Charles Whitman's live-stream declaration went viral. Overnight, it wasn't just a company story, it was a national reckoning. Talk shows ran it on repeat. Old news clips of Ernest sweeping floors aired with emotional music. Hashtags like #HadFoundFather and #BuiltFromBlood trended for days. But Ernest didn't care about trending. He was still processing the weight of something he never thought he'd feel again, a son's pride. He didn't return to work, not after that day. Instead, he stayed home, letting the silence settle. He replayed Charles's words like scripture. The voice, the eyes, the fire. It was all his. The boy he lost was still alive. And he remembered. Then the doorbell rang. A courier. A single white envelope. No return address. Inside, a handwritten letter. Neat, firm strokes. No company header. No titles. Just, Dad. You once told me a name means nothing unless you earn it. I've spent my whole life building a name, but I didn't earn yours. I'd like to try now. Charles, your son always... Attached was a photograph. Charles at age 6. Ernest holding his hand. A memory long buried, now framed in ink. Ernest clutched it like oxygen. But he wasn't the only one healing. At the next annual conference, Charles walked on stage and said, before we talk profit, let's talk sacrifice. Behind him, the massive LED screen flickered on. A photo, Ernest mopping the marble halls. Caption, the man who built this company's foundation, literally. The crowd rose in applause. Investors, employees, strangers. But backstage, something more personal waited. Ernest, invited by Charles, stood quietly behind the curtain. He wore a simple shirt, the same work boots he used to mop in, and a shy smile. Charles pulled him into a hug, tight, long, unapologetic. And then, a month later, Ernest sat in a modest recliner, sunlight filtering through the blinds of his small living room. On the wall hung the only decoration he cared for, now a photo of him and Charles on stage, both smiling through tears. Beneath it, Charles had scrawled in black marker, "My foundation, my father." The phone rang. It wasn't Charles this time. It was the White House. The press secretary herself, Mr. Ernest Whitman. The president would like to meet you. He almost dropped the phone. At first, he refused. But Charles insisted. Dad, it's not about politics. It's about your story. Men like you, fathers like you built this country. It's time people remembered. Days later, Ernest walked into the East Room in his best jacket, the one he saved for church now pressed like armor. Cameras flashed, but his hands were steady. On live television, he received the Presidential Medal of Civic Honor for quiet service, perseverance, and the invisible labor that shapes a nation. The citation read, "For every floor swept in silence, for every child raised without praise, for building legacies without spotlight, we see you now." But the twist no one expected. Charles stepped up next to the president, took the mic, and announced, "We've created the Ernest Foundation. Full scholarships, mentorships, and job placement for children of janitors, guards, cooks, and cleaners. Because no future should overlook its builders." The room erupted. Journalists cried. Janitors watching from staff quarters across the country felt seen for the first time. And Ernest, he walked off stage, not into shadows, but into a sunlit path he never imagined. The janitor who was once forgotten became the name whispered in boardrooms, schools, and homes. He never asked for thanks. He just asked that his story help another father keep going when the world forgets he exists. Because in the end, love swept every floor he ever touched. If this story moved you or opened your eyes, don't forget